Pop quiz. Name the textile that's entire fabric is dependent on boiling bugs alive. Don't know the answer? Stay tuned, you'll find out. But yeah, silk. It's the most luxurious fabric, but the most deadly. And before we get into the what, whens, hows, whys of its deadliness, I'm actually just going to kind of quickly cover a brief history of silk. I made fancy little graphics for y'all, for my visual people. I got you. Silk's been around a long time. The earliest established form of making silk that we know of is definitely during the Neolithic Chinese era. They say it's like the 4th century, but I also don't understand how the time works. Time got messed up because of colonization. And so now we all have to live with that. All I know is that the ancient Chinese dynasty, the Qin dynasty, Qin, Qin dynasty, that existed around the same time as ancient Greece, ancient Rome, that kind of vibe. Ancient Egypt was during the Shang dynasty, which was several centuries before, but it's labeled as like the 6th century. I don't know, okay? They messed it up. They messed time up. The Qing dynasty, that's what we know as the Yellow dynasty with the Yellow Emperor. His wife Lazlo of Xiling actually discovered how to make silk. And it was totally by accident. She was sipping on some tea, looking at these cute little silkworms eating the mulberry bush tree thing. Anywho, she was drinking her tea, looking at the cute little worms, and then they were turning into little moths, you know, and their little pupas, and then one of the pupas fell into her piping hot tea and boiled itself alive. And she noticed when it did do that, when it done that it created these interesting fibers, you know, the stringy fibers and silk. It made silk. They're silkworms. Apparently boiling them alive adds a different property to the silk that wasn't found in other types of silk production, because they weren't, China wasn't the only person who ever makes silk. They were the only ones to make the best silk. She actually is the one who kind of convinced people to like weave it, to make a loom, to use it in a loom. And so people started weaving these fabrics. Lazlo actually created what we now know as sericulture, which is essentially the rearing and domesticating of silkworms for the purpose of producing silk. This type of silk was only really native to Asia, specifically to China, because they hadn't really started trading with the Western world. So next we have the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty was actually the first dynasty that made silk a sign of status. The poor people weren't allowed to have silk, and actually during this time frame only certain people could make silk. You had to be a certain kind of artisan crafter to make silk. It wasn't until the Silk Road that the rest of the world got to interact with the silk, mainly because that was the first trading route that had actually opened up access to the Western world from the eastern side of the world. And you know, it was a hoot. Everyone loved the silk. They were losing their minds. And actually it's rumored that the reason why Rome fell was because they were so obsessed with the silk, and they just ruined their savings. They had absolutely no silver left. So yeah, Roman Empire falls, everyone's still trading, still passing things along, but then we started seeing that as more parts of the world got access to the silk, we saw different cultures kind of put their own spins on it. A prime example would be Palestinians. In Gaza around the 5th century, they actually figured out how to weave silk into an absorbable fabric that actually created gauze. Gaza created gauze. No jokes. I just want us to take a moment, because right now they are being completely annihilated with nowhere to go, and they don't even have access to their own medical supply that has been used to save millions and millions of lives throughout history. I can't talk about any kind of weaving or any kind of, any of that stuff without mentioning them, because they became one of the most renowned weaving centers in the world because of their craftsmanship and the quality of their weaving and just the heart that you can tell they put into it. And so the fact that, we may not have as many people who know how to weave like that because of people's greed. Y'all just keep an eye on them. Keep an eye on them. After the 5th century, we see that the Byzantine Empire starts to poke their nose around. So for those of y'all who don't know what the Byzantine Empire have been doing, they've been out colonizing, stealing land, breaking up families, destroying cultures and all that, and they're broke. They finish colonizing one part of the world and they're like, hey, we're broke. We need fast money. How do we get fast money? And then he stumbled upon 2 monks who were traveling around Asia, specifically China. And the monks were like, hey, yo, you want these seeds? You want these little tiny caterpillars in these trees to make some money? We also know how they do it. We can trade secrets. And they actually created the first documented case of industrial espionage. Because after they had done this, now the eggs and the trees started spreading all over. They went to France, to Italy, they went to India, they went pretty much everywhere, even in the US. It caused for there to be an influx of fancy silk on the market. Now China wasn't the only one with this type of silk or that knew how to make it like this, but they could never really make it in the same quality. And that was pretty obvious to a lot of people, even after everyone kind of started making their own versions. A lot of people, if they could swing it, they would choose to purchase the ancient Chinese silk. Sucks that y'all stole it in the first place, because now we're seeing a lot of issues. But we'll go into that in a second. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire has fallen. Why? Because the Ottomans took down Constantinople. Istanbul was Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. There's no more Silk Road because the Ottomans were like, nah, we're good. We stole a city. Different cultures have managed to somewhat domesticate similar species of either animals or plants that are native, keyword, native to their land. So there's a few environmental issues that come with stealing plants and animals from other continents and bringing them onto your own for the sake of a quick cash grab. Silkworms, especially the Bombyx mori, eat white mulberry trees. The reason why in their native environment the Bombyx mori and the white mulberry work so harmoniously together is because the white mulberry tree can reproduce fast, if not faster, than the Bombyx mori caterpillars can. And these caterpillars eat about 1 pound a day of these leaves. It's harmonious when it's in the correct environment, but the thing is that when you bring them to other environments, and for example, your land can't sustain the white mulberry tree because the roots are too shallow, or it produces way too quickly and overtakes ecosystems and overcompetes and kills out other species that are really important to other bugs' ecosystems and other animals' ecosystems, you see an extinction of different species or endangering of species. And the same goes with the caterpillar. If you have an influx of those caterpillars who don't have that tree in an environment that can sustain them, they will strip all of the trees and plants bare. They will just take down entire ecosystems. And once you have the infestations of them, it's really, really hard to get rid of them. The type of fungus that they use to try to control these moths is actually called like a Myrmiga fungus, which worked when there was a huge infestation in 1981 in Connecticut, of all places. However, it created a couple more invasive species, one of them being the honey fungus, and the other one being these little worms, two-line chestnut borers. I didn't even know what that was. I had to look it up, and they're ugly little buggers. Oof. I was really curious about just where they were invasive to. They're invasive to multiple continents. Even in China and Korea and Japan and Taiwan and Nepal and Asia, you know, they're considered invasive because they don't really exist anywhere in the wild. We have other types of silkworms, but for the Bombyx mori specifically, it only exists in captivity. Outside of Asia, for invasiveness, we have Bulgaria, France, Germany, Italy. We have South America and Pakistan and Thailand and Brazil. It's also invasive in the US. I mean, you just heard me talk about Connecticut. Apparently in Connecticut, there were two different instances. And that's when they tried to use the fungus and it created more problems. But then there was a huge outbreak for some reason in 2015 to 2018. Let me fact check. Yeah, they were covering houses, trees, streets, windshields, what have you. They haven't really done very great in the United States. The United States itself tried to implement using and creating silk whenever there was a lull in the cotton production. And can we guess when that was? If you said the Civil War, you were correct. It was when we were trying to make sure that people weren't being owned as property for the sake of mass production. All these places have tried to control these, and the only people who've been truly successful in properly managing the outbreaks of these bugs has been China so far. Maybe India. I haven't heard them having much problems in India, but at the same time, India has its own problems. There's a lot of ethical problems too. For example, to make the silk, it's considered, a lot of people consider it to be animal cruelty because we don't exactly know for sure how sentient these animals are, but we do have enough information and data to this day to be able to say that they're somewhat sentient in the way that they can feel pain and process pain. And so when we're just breeding them for the sake of keeping them alive to reproduce, to try to, you know, go through metamorphosis only to be boiled alive, it feels a little cruel. Not to mention all the other humanitarian issues with it. I had a feeling that there was, you know, especially because of fast fashion with Shein and all that, and Shein is out of China, that there is a lot of child labor in the textile industry. A couple of examples of places where child labor is really an issue, specifically in the silk industry. One of the biggest ones is India. Now, they are considered one of the top 3 producers of silk in the world. And I think a lot of that does have to do with how much they rely on poor people to sign their kids up for bonded labor in order to help make payments for, you know, shelter and food. Bonded labor is essentially when a child is guaranteed work from their employer as long as there is a loan or a payment associated with it. So a lot of families who are really, really poor, and we could talk about the caste system another day, but for right now, for the sake of conversation, essentially the bonded labor practice works the best when you target and prey on poor families who don't have any other means to sustain themselves or survive. So kids as young as 5 will be sticking their hands in vats of scalding water to feel these pupas. You will have kids working 12 plus hours a day to produce silk, and then they just have a bunch of burns, and a lot of these kids don't know anything else but to make silk. They are pulled out of schools, or they're not allowed to go to school. All they know is how to make silk. They may not be able to read, they may not be able to write, but they know how to make silk, and it's really sad. In Uzbekistan, they have what they call forced labor. And essentially what that means is that if a government, usually it's like an authoritative or a dictatorship, If a government has control over the means of production and the population, plus the land that the population is forced to work on, they actually have a huge bargaining chip. If these workers don't make enough money or profit or enough quota, like product quotas, not only will they be threatened with having their land taken from them, they will be withheld from much needed ag supplies, as well as they can be prosecuted if they're not meeting those quotas. And prosecution can look anywhere from being fined a lot of money or being physically brutalized. One of the things that I like to look up is concurrent events in history that usually we're kind of convinced are happening at different times, like how the Cambodian genocide happened alongside the Vietnam War. Cambodia actually made silk with this technique that's called ikat. They used to weave silk culturally as a way to honor and connect with their ancestors, down to like the methodology of making the silk and the dyeing of it and all of that. Around the 1970s, when Vietnam was happening, the Khmer Rouge regime, they called themselves a communist party. They essentially murdered 1.5 to 3 million people, native Cambodians. Because of this genocide, you could not really find someone who knew the original 1,000-year-old weaving techniques. It just massacred their culture. I actually saw a cool video, and I'm linking all my sources down below, but there is a woman she was one of the surviving weavers, and she actually has spent the last 20 years teaching her people the art of this weaving technique, and it's really cool. When I saw the Cambodian genocide happening alongside Vietnam, which was essentially a Vietnamese genocide, it just seems very, very relevant to today, because right now we have multiple genocides happening at one time. I'm noticing that events like this happen at 2 or 3 at the same time. Today's no different. Right now we're witnessing millions and millions of Palestinians who have been brutalized over the past 100 years and occupied. We're seeing them crying for help as they're cornered and executed. Gaza is said to be one of the most renowned weaving centers globally. And I'm so worried that what happened to Cambodia with their weaving and their art is going to happen to Gaza and to the Palestinian people. Their kufiya, which I've wanted one for so long, I just haven't been able to get one, but their kufiya is literal woven history down to the fabric. And it's a beautiful work of art. Everyone knows the difference between a real kufiya and a fake kufiya because you can see it, you can feel it. And I'm just really terrified that they're going to lose that part of their culture. I didn't mean to get all emotional. Recently I've gone through an eviction process where I had to go to court, and the whole time I just kept thinking about everyone in Rafa right now who made it and all those who didn't, how they were being displaced from their homes, and I've been thinking of them nonstop. They actually inspired me to start doing this series. Sorry about that. I was rudely interrupted by my phone storage being full. Crazy timing. But anyway, I started making this series, this channel specifically, because of a video I watched over the symbolism behind the kufiya and the way it's woven and the cultural ties it has and the history of rebellion and resilience. A really cool quote that I saw that actually inspired me to keep going with this series, not just for silk, but for all the textiles, was the quote by Arabelle Zaccardi that says, "Textile work is cultural work." Bars. That's all I'm going to say. Anyway, see you next time. Bye.